It's been 6 o'clock, and hence I will start with this webinar meeting of the new fall season of the ZHdK Art Talk series. I welcome you to this format, which is hosted by the Department of Fine Arts. My name is Gabrielle Schad. I will be moderating these talks. Before introducing my guest tonight, Prem Sahib, I'd like to give you a short preview of the semester's program and also thank in advance all my colleagues who helped and joined forces to invite great artists to our program here at ZHdK. Those are Svetlana Heger-Davis, Raphael Gigax, Judith Welter, and Marie-France Raphael. So warm thank you to the team. What awaits us this semester is, of course, tonight, Prem Sahib's talk. Then on 3rd of November, we'll have the pleasure to speak to Patterson Beckwith, who is a founding member of Art Club 2000, a collective having their retrospective currently at the Kunsthalle Zurich. The talk is also a collaboration or cooperation with the Kunsthalle Zurich. On 11th of November, we'll have the pleasure to talk to Anne Imhoff, world famous performance artists. You certainly came across over the last years, who will be in conversation with my colleague Marie-France Raphael. And on 1st of December, we'll talk to Beatrice Gibson, artist and filmmaker. Beatrice will also be guest professor or visiting lecturer in the Master Fine Arts program in this fall term. Some technical things around the art talks. The format will be recorded and archived, put on the YouTube channel by the Department of Fine Arts. So if you want to point out a specific conversation to some of your friends who couldn't attend, please do so. The lectures should appear online after they took place. In the webinar format, you're of course also very welcome to participate, even if it's a little bit more distanced. So please use the Q&A tool, type your questions in. I will pick them up towards the end of the conversation or of Prem's talk. So we'll be sure to get them answered. You can also raise your hand. It's usually a bit more difficult to keep track of the order people raising their hands, but we'll try our best so everyone gets a chance to address their questions or even enter into conversation if you feel like appearing on that screen as well. So let me say a few words about our guest tonight. Prem Sahib is also a visiting lecturer in the Bachelor of Fine Arts program this semester. We're very excited about that, and thank you for making time to join us tonight via Zoom. You told me before you're sitting in London, so that gives our audience an idea where you currently are on the globe. And just a few words about his trajectory. Prem Sahib studied at the Slade School of Fine Art, graduated in London, graduated in 2006. And afterwards graduated in a MA program, Material and Visual Culture from the University College London, UCL, in 2008, and followed up with a formation at the Royal Academy Schools of Art, graduating in 2013. The work of Prem Sahib references the architecture of public and private spaces and structures that shape individual and communal identities, senses of belonging, alienation, and confinement. Mixing the personal and the political, abstraction and figuration, their formalism is suggestive of the body as well as its absence, drawing attention to traces of touch and frameworks of looking. Sahib's work has been shown widely, including solo institutional exhibitions at Kunstverein Hamburg in 2017, and Side On, ICA London in 2015, as well as in group shows that include the Sharjah Art Foundation, Migros Museum für Gegenwartskunst, Whitechapel Gallery, Hayward Gallery, KW Institute of Art in Berlin, the Moines Art Centre, and the Gwangju Biennale. Sahib's work is in the collections of Tate, the Arts Council, Government Art Collection UK, the Astrup Fearnley Museum of Modern Art in Norway, and the MOMA in Australia. So welcome again, Prem. Really nice to have you with us tonight. And I would leave the floor to you to share whatever you have prepared for us. And I'm really happy that we'll get a chance also to speak about your work afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Here we go. Hope that's visible to everyone. So I'm going to move more or less chronologically through three main exhibitions with a few detours along the way. And I'll try not to spend too long on past work, because it would be good to get to some more recent stuff. But just to begin, in the very broadest sense, like you mentioned in your introduction, I guess I would say that I'm interested in the structures that we inhabit that shape our sense of self, as well as our relation to others. So be it physical or environmental structures like architecture, or social ones. And I'm going to start by talking you through my exhibition at the ICA in London in 2015, so quite a few years ago now. And I'm just going to focus mostly on the lower gallery that you see here. The exhibition went across 3 rooms, but because of time, I'm just going to whiz through the upstairs galleries, I think, and try and focus a little bit more on what's going on down here. So the exhibition was called Side On, and I quite liked that it sounded like an alternative view or a way of looking that deviates from seeing something front on. And if you're familiar with the ICA, then you'll recognize that the downstairs gallery looks quite different these days. And what I did at the time was to clad the entire back wall, which usually has very large windows. And I did that just to install this one work, which actually also looks like a window. And it's actually a light box called After Hours, and it creates this illusion of depth while blocking out the actual view, which was to the park outside. And I wanted it to feel quite closed in and hermetic in this lower gallery, so that reflections and tensions between other works and objects became more enhanced. And the work was also placed purposely high to evade eye level. And I felt like this also added to the tension between materials and surfaces in the room. So the window itself resembled the sort that you might find in a public toilet, where materials like frosted glass are used to discourage visual exchange between inside and out, keeping the emphasis on bodily function and interiority. And this light box is actually a replica of a window from a now demolished cruising site in a park in West London that I used to go to when I was younger. So some of the work has this kind of autobiographical starting point, but then it's often transformed or obscured through abstraction. And it's not so important for me that viewers are always aware of these backstories. I like to think of them as still being present in material and formal qualities. So at the time, I was thinking a lot about the specifics of materials used in public design and how they have a palpable effect on us as subjects of a space. This kind of idea that we make or construct the material world and it consequently makes us as moral personhoods. So I was using a lot of materials like ceramics, glass and metal, which I still do. And I quite like thinking about these materials in terms of their slipperiness or ideas around anonymity or collective use, as well as hygiene. And my use of tiles, for example, stems from an interest in spaces in which you normally find them. So places like bathrooms or domestic space, public toilets, or spaces where the spaces that are both public and private and where the body is enacted upon somehow. I like how tiles are wipeable and utilitarian and cold, but also formally how they reiterate some of their ideological values through repetition. And so with a lot of this earlier work, I was thinking about objects creating an equivalence with the viewer's body as a means of forging some kind of empathetic relation between subjects and objects. So the tiled structure that you see here is part of a series called Watch Queens. And Watch Queen is the colloquial name given to those in cruising scenarios that are on the lookout for anything that might interrupt the action rather than actively participating. So they kind of take on this architectural stature, kind of like being the eyes and the ears. And I like how this name also ascribes something figurative to the object. So regardless of whether you're familiar with that term, it also sounds a bit like a command or an assertion. So this Watch Queen was placed in a corridor, which is typically a space for viewers to pass through, and it kind of surveyed the exhibition. And I'm going to talk a bit more about it taking on this more regulatory role through some other work that I'll get to a bit later in the talk. And these works that you see in front of you, they're a bit like fleshy doorways that have collapsed in on themselves or are coming together or breaking apart, a bit like broken links in a chain. So forms that maybe suggest the capacity for connections. And clearly, I often get asked a lot about minimalism for obvious reasons in regards to my work. And it's not really my agenda to be making work about minimalism as an art historical canon, but I do like the idea of destabilizing some of what we've come to associate it with, because I often use my own experience of sexuality as a material. I'm inevitably queering, I feel, some of the associations of that tradition. And I would say I'm more interested in abstraction and formalism and ideas around physicality that are also part of that movement. But the other thing about the materials that I was using is that they don't like attachments. So there were instances where I was trying to bring certain things together forcibly in order to make them stick, such as with these puffer jackets that you see sandwiched in between glass and stacked precariously on top of one another. So when I began using these jackets, I was thinking about them as materials that we wear to kind of cushion us from our environment, that sit between our body and the space that we're in, but also as forms that we can hide behind. And of course, this capacity to blend or be anonymous, which inevitably has different consequences for different bodies. But I also like thinking of the jackets as multiples of the same form, which are so ubiquitous and also kind of speak of consumer culture and the limited, but at the same time plentiful ways that they offer a form of individual expression, and how collectively they become a kind of uniform. And then thinking about uniforms as being restrictive in the same way that these jackets are kind of restricted between sheets of glass with all the air kind of squeezed out of them until they become pictorial and flat. So these particular ones operate a bit like sculpture in the round. You could walk around them and you could see reflections of the room or other works. And resting on them on the edge, you can see these kind of small jesmonite eggs that were cast in jesmonite. And they're just balancing on the edge, sort of teetering on the edge of collapse. Again, they were sort of born out of specific encounters, which I won't go into detail about now, but reflect the contested nature of public space. And they were placed at sort of suggestive heights and colored in flesh-like tones. So moving on to other objects in the room, towards the back of the gallery was this big tiled structure, which was quite different from the other tiled works in the Watch Queen series. So this actually existed in the world elsewhere. And I had been going to this sauna, a gay sauna called Chariots, which was quite an important site in East London to me and to a broader community. But I had been going there, and in wanting to protect the kind of ideas around privacy within that public space, I chose not to ever document it photographically, but instead to transcribe some of the objects and furniture that existed there that interested me by using my body. So I would, for example, like measure this. I would be that crazy person in the sauna who's kind of like appearing to measure an object with their hands, but then kind of make this equivalent form again in the very public space of a gallery like the ICA. And the objects that you see in and around it kind of form part of this still life. So here, there's all this popcorn which has been cast in jesmonite again. So it's a bit like kind of ceramic and ceramic touching. And it to me suggests like this kind of frenzied action, but it's also something that kind of accompanies the consumption of image. So I was thinking about how other bodies and image are consumed in these places, and the other items that existed on this as part of the still life was this kind of laptop looking form, which is a piece of steel that's been polished and folded in half. And it was these kind of things I was interested in, thinking through how little something needs to be done to a material in order for us to ascribe meaning to it. So it sort of becomes like this like immaterial space, or this kind of virtual element. And here was a bottle of cleaning fluid that had been cast in a block of resin. So it was sort of encapsulated in this colored form. On the wall, there was a small painting, which was part of a series I've been making using resin for quite some time now. And each dot is painted by hand with an epoxy resin. So it has this kind of effect of looking like a wet surface that's had this kind of contact or interruption through a body, but actually it's a kind of composition that I've painted through studying various wet surfaces, and I've kind of constructed that image dot by dot. So although the effect looks quite immediate, it's actually quite a labored process to arrive there. And I kind of think of these works in relation to contact between a substance and a surface. And I'll show you some later works, but the ones in silver, for example, kind of used this silver anodized metal, which is a very like industrial material. And I think a lot of the works in this exhibition were trying to, as I mentioned before, encourage a more kind of empathetic relation from the viewer through creating this equivalence of them perhaps acting in ways that might be attributed to a body. So like I nicknamed these works sweat panels, for instance. So it kind of took on this anthropomorphic role. And up on the concourse where the Watch Queen was, were these neons that I'd made. And you can probably see the relationship between the mark making in this painting and the neons. And that's because I was thinking about the movement across that surface as something physical. And I made these works by sculpting them in metal and a kind of armature wire that's very malleable, and then working with a neon fabricator who kind of turns those gestures into these delicate glass objects. And they're programmed digitally to simulate breathing. So they kind of light up and then they dissipate again. So again, this kind of equivalence with the body, you kind of get the idea through these two images, I hope. And this is when I'm going to make some detours and go a bit back in time. I just wanted to show you some of the kind of lineage to how I might arrive at some work. So prior to the ICA exhibition, this is how the Watch Queens were existing, as these kind of really elongated large plinths that these glass neon objects perched on. And the difference was that the neon objects here don't have any of the components that make them light up. So they're a bit like a carcass of a neon, and I kind of called them dead neons. And they are just this black glass that sit on this slippery ceramic plinth, if you like. And some of them kind of almost resembled signage or letters, and some were more simple, and others maybe more elaborate. And then sort of going back in time to show you some of the previous works using jackets, they began almost like me sandwiching them as though you might kind of inspect something under a microscope using glass slides, to ones that maybe incorporated more bodies where there was this sort of suggestion or question about like whether they're coming together in a loving sense or something more aggressive, or something more repetitive and formal, using headphones as well. And then others more recently experimenting with them coming away from the glass and performing differently. So here they kind of look like they're kind of either seeking shelter, this work is called Umbra, under the kind of protection of the glass, or perhaps kind of playfully fooling around. I kind of like using materials in a way that maybe go against how you think you know them to act. So the kind of fluidity of the fabric somehow performing something rigid in order to sustain an idea of the object as a whole. And in this case, the kind of flirtation with the object becoming functional. So these weren't works that were in the ICA show, but have some connection to those works that I showed in 2015. And this is another example of a plinth that I measured in the dark room in the chariot sauna I mentioned, which measured 11 hands by 10, and that became the title of this work. So there was this transcription of the physical space into a sculptural form where I might be able to talk about my encounters there through certain objects, such as these cast electrical cords in proximity to dog bowls full of resin that look like water, or steel forms that appear to be floating on duvets. And I kind of began thinking about those still life forms on these cold tiled structures, a bit like kind of nests in a way. And here is one that I think took that form more obviously, and amongst all the different parts that it was composed of was this ring. And jewelry is something that has entered my work quite a bit. I think mostly in thinking about it as a kind of object that sits close to the body and mediates ideas of value for the person looking at it as well as the person wearing it. And just to talk through some of these works I make in galleries that can only be viewed from the outside when the gallery's closed, I feel like they have quite a specific relationship to the resin works I showed you, such as the block of blue resin cast with the cleaning fluid inside. This idea of being on the outside looking in and not having access to a space, but maybe having kind of idea of it, like an extrusion of space. So maybe this is a better example where you would see this work after the gallery had closed and you were on the outside, and then you perhaps maybe see something like this on the inside, which kind of has this residual relationship to it as an extrusion of that space. And upstairs at the ICA, I presented some posters in the dark, which kind of led viewers around a maze-like structure to the final rooms, but they also were posters for other exhibitions of mine. And here is an example of another tiled structure where the materiality of the tiles is kind of used differently on the external parts and the internal parts. So I kind of like thinking about this as referencing maybe two cubicle doors where you would usually enter into a private space, but you walk through this sculpture, momentarily see your reflection, and you're back into a public space again. And this is the part that I'm going to whiz through before I don't have time for other works. But going back to the sweat panel that I showed you, a silver one-off, I think I mentioned I work with quite a restrained palette, always using the same clear resin, but I change often the surface itself. And I kind of like the different bodily associations that might, or substance associations that might accompany that change in surface. So here I kind of think of the gold ones as more pissy, for example. And these ones are actually portraits of people, human urinals in clubs in Berlin. And the final room at the ICA had some black panels, which I always think of as operating more architecturally as these kind of portals out of the space. And you might be able to make out how the mark making crosses over into the adjacent panel. So I also think of them as part of a larger pictorial space, and some of them have more abstracted bodily marks, and some of them have more obvious hand gestures. And this is a piece of furniture that's kind of, again, in a similar vein to the one with the hoodie that I showed you, is kind of just about sustaining this idea of function. And lastly, I'm just going to end this section with talking about this tile work, because it's one that I've been making consistently for such a long time. It's a printed ceramic tile, and it's the site, the cruising site that I first showed you the window of. It's basically the view that you see while standing at a urinal facing a white tiled wall. It's the kind of view of the park behind you outside. And I think, just to say about my interest in cruising, it's kind of comes more from thinking about how we might interact with materials and space in a novel way that maybe goes against intended use. So I like thinking about tiles that maybe reveal something behind you, or kind of, in this case, create an image as a stain, so not something that can be wiped away. And I always print the same image again and again and again, but the color that kind of washes over the surface changes in each one. So I kind of like thinking of it as quite transportative, taking the viewer to that exact place where I was standing. And this is another instance of jewelry that I mentioned I use in my work. So a kind of small sentimental pendant that's scaled up to the size of the head resting on a pillow. Or these tiles that have fake diamond earrings that kind of come together a bit like constellations, and they kind of, the surface appears to buckle as though skin might. Or this work, which is called Flesh Tunnel, which pierced an actual wall so that you can put your whole hand through it, but not feel where the room begins and ends. Or these rings that kind of have this invisible fixing that make them quite disconcerting to stand in front of, and reference more intimate jewelry like cock rings, but also just materials touching like rubber and steel. So I'm gonna now move on to my exhibition at the Kunstverein in 2017. So this is jumping ahead a few years, and a lot had changed actually. So for instance, the Chariot sauna that I mentioned earlier had closed, and it closed to make way for a luxury hotel development. And so I began working a lot more with objects from that space, or replicas of things that were found there, rather than my kind of memory of certain furniture or interior fittings. And what you see here is the installation, which the space itself is essentially like a white cube. And so I made certain changes, such as adding a wall very at the back of the space with two doorways that led to a dark space, but also inserting this kind of fake ceiling that you see, this new drop ceiling. And it's a bit like the sort that you might find in an office or a workspace. And I removed certain tiles so that it created this kind of liminal space between the actual architecture and this fake ceiling. And it's where I placed some of the breathing neons, which seemed to be kind of nesting in that space, and they would light up and dim. And so you'd get a sense of their presence, but not really a sense of their form. And it wasn't until you walked up to the second floor of the museum, where there was another show on, that you would maybe get a glimpse of them. So the title of the exhibition, Balconies, kind of came from me seeing lots of new build flats pop up around my studio and around that time. And it was at a point in London, I think, where lots of unaffordable housing was being built. So the development taking place was very kind of prevalent. And I began thinking about the balcony as a space that sits close to a building, but offers some relief from the domestic, as well as this view from above, and perhaps like an alternative view. And so I mentioned that I began working with some of the objects from the chariot sauna. And one of the things I couldn't find anywhere else in the world was peculiarly this head of David, because they're so common, but I couldn't find this particular one until I did a site visit in Hamburg, and they actually put me up in a hotel that used to be a brothel, and I came across the exact one. So I managed to cast it in this kind of purpley, powdery color that looked a bit like asphyxiated flesh or like a crumbly pill. And I placed it on this IKEA sofa, which for me was quite emblematic of the time somehow. It was IKEA's best-selling sofa, and I kept seeing it on webcam chats, and for me it kind of spoke to a kind of modular living, because it was this very small, tasteful and affordable sofa that you would typically find in new builds, and it could transform into a bed. And yeah, it kind of somehow reflected the times for me. So that was the first object that you encountered in the exhibition. But the main work that occupied the room consists of these 12 lockers, which were presented on very low-lying plinths. And as I've shown you with the ICA show, some of the work I've made has focused on spaces where sex has been part of the design, or which act as meeting places for certain communities. But now was also thinking about how some of those spaces had closed or were being transformed because of forces such as gentrification. So it's never been a case of a kind of studious or anthropological inquiry for me. It's always been quite connected to places that I had a relationship or curiosity about. So yeah, I found these lockers in the car park of Chariots with a sign on them that said, "Please help yourself." And so I did, and I managed to keep them in my studio for quite some time before I decided that they might become work. This is a fountain that also was in the original Chariot space, which I found a replica for and cast it in this kind of shadowy gray, much like the space in which it was found. And for me, it kind of becomes an instance of some of the objects that I cast in this way as a means of sort of stripping them of their function and kind of making them more into an image idea of themselves, kind of making them denying them of their use. But going back to the lockers, collectively they spoke through their material culture of the history of the space, and they had various kind of signs that also said something about the space that they came from. They were obviously quite bodily in their stature and contained these stickers and signs and leaflets and other paraphernalia for things like sexual health services or gay housing associations or work by street artists. And you can see in the top corner one of the stickers. This is not the one, but there were a sticker that kept on recurring in many of the lockers was one that said, "Do you care? We do." And It is, but you can't see it. And for me, and that became the title of the work. So collectively, the 12 lockers were called Do You Care, We Do. And it summarized quite a big question for me, which is how does one navigate being an individual as part of a community? But it also became this sort of rhetorical question about care, belonging, and isolation. And this is like some work by a street artist called Paula Chien. So it was quite strange living with these objects outside of or divorced from the space in which they came. So they kind of became archival, and thinking about what that means, I was sort of interested in them maybe preserving something divorced from that original context as a means of being able to challenge the authority of where it came from, but also the situation that it exists in now, as a means for like one world to infect another. So, they moved from one institution into another, and it was quite amusing because some of the stickers, such as the one that you see here, laminated aromas available from reception, obviously in the Chariots space was referring to poppers, but many viewers would go to the front of the museum, front of the gallery, and ask for aromas, which clearly they didn't have. Another object that was a replica was this decorative object that was again originally from Chariots, and I made these giant piercings to fix it to the wall, kind of aggressively, and I wanted to interrupt the image of this Greek god Nike awarding an athlete. So it's like this quite muscly male body, and that was kind of born from an interest in thinking about the types of histories that are often referenced in these spaces, and how the image of certain bodies is literally built into the architecture as a kind of somatic norm. So this idea of like constantly embellishing this relief with piercings, for me, was a way to maybe weaken it or to confuse what was body and what was object. And you see some images of it from the side, it kind of just lifts off the wall. So it's also kind of this act or this gesture of removing it from its place. And to counter this use of all the found objects that speak of a particular cultural heritage and community, I also had a made object, which was a replica of my first birthday cake. So in contrast to the lockers, this work spoke more directly about an individual, and it was a sculpture which was presented in this kind of dark room and spotlit very theatrically. So I worked with a food model maker who produced an exact copy of the cake in resin and rubber, working mostly from a family photograph, but also from the memory of my mum. And the installation included the exact Remploy chairs that you see and the exact matchbox from the image. And there was something quite uncanny and deathly about standing in front of it, something almost out of body that I was interested in. And clearly the aesthetic is very 80s, and it included things that I felt pointed to my own South Asian heritage, such as the inclusion of my full name. Clearly the chairs are the sort that are sort of found in a community hall, and the scale of the cake suggested a large celebration, which was significant because I was the first boy to be born in the family. And as a work, I was interested in thinking about this object as something that was made to celebrate my identity before it had really emerged, but also how it was made to be consumed by a community and a family. So I'm going to move on to a more recent exhibition now, which is Descent. And this exhibition took place at Southard Reed in London. It began in 2019, and it was an exhibition in 3 parts. So at the time, I didn't want to feel limited or confined by how I might be expected to have a show in a given space with time constraints. And because what I wanted to say felt bigger than that, I wanted to work across these kind of episodes, basically. So forge a new relationship with the viewer coming back and maybe having missed one part, or kind of contextualizing what they were seeing through what was to come or what had been. And so the entirety of what I wanted to say began to emerge like these kind of connected episodes with this overarching narrative called Descent. And I was thinking about descent both as a passage through time and space, as well as descent as kind of lineage in a way. So each part lasted 3 weeks, and it began with an installation, and then there was a video and an archive, and then it ended with a kind of object response to the earlier parts. So part 1 was People Come and Go, and it was modeled on this men-only cruising club in the neighborhood of the gallery, like kind of maybe like a mile away. And it was a really immersive installation, which is not a phrase I usually like to use, but it truly was, in that you opened the door of what was the gallery, and then it was like stepping into this built environment that mirrored, you know, exactly the space of this cruising club around the corner. And there wasn't much of a kind of detour you could make other than follow this narrow corridor, which was spotlit. So you would open the door, which was left ajar, and you were confronted by this kind of corrugated steel wall. And so I put in a new floor, a new ceiling, and added different lighting. And by remaking the environment, I was trying to question something about my experience of being in predominantly white or gendered spaces. So it's not something that I'd sort of really interrogated as much with the past work. But I wanted to try and remake this environment outside of the space, in order to sort of engage with some of the politics around it more openly. You know, things like my experiences of racism there, for instance, or how kind of certain ideas around whiteness and desire. And so beyond making the exact environment, I also had a performer. So you would walk down this narrow corridor and you would approach this archway, much like you do in that club. And there was sometimes, depending on when you'd come, a body inside, and other times there were just clues of habitation, such as this kind of t-shirt or coins or a wallet, this kind of makeshift bin on this plinth. And then there might be this body, which was a performer, always a kind of different performer, but specifically the same sort of demographic. So a kind of white male performer that appeared to be passed out or sleeping. And I was also kind of thinking about them supposedly being trapped in this environment, for which I was suggesting that they were the beneficiary of. And yeah. These are some of the different performers. And just to give you a sense of scale, this is the installation in my studio. So when you came back for part 2, that had all been removed and was significantly different. The experience of the gallery was now back to being this white walled space. And instead you'd encounter this archive immediately, and then further back in the space where that archway was and where that performer was passed out, there was a video. And this second part was called Cul-de-sac. So I presented a video that was shot on the street where I grew up in Southall, which is a suburb of West London that's home to a large South Asian community. And this second episode really emerged from me exploring my connection to, as well as disenfranchisement from, a place that I called home. So my dad passed away in 2018, and I was intrigued to hear more about his experiences as a young person arriving in this country. And I already knew about some of the history of the area that I grew up in. But when I started to learn some of these personal histories, I realized quite how traumatic some of them were. And I'd learned, for instance, how he had been stabbed in the leg by the National Front, which were a right-wing group during the race riots of 1979, for example. And then in speaking to my dad's brother, I learned about a lot of the outreach work that he was doing, and social work, helping people with drug problems, HIV, mental health issues. And he was involved in like a lot of activism in the area. And he mentioned to me, once I expressed an interest about these histories, that he had a folder of clippings that he had kept personally, of some of that history. And so I decided to share it as a kind of both the historical and contextual device to the video that I also happen to be making about my relationship to that area. And it just kind of really struck me that I had, that none of these things were really discussed amongst us. And I guess because they're difficult histories, it wasn't always easy. But so many of the issues that the archive brings to attention are also very pertinent today, you know, such as police stop and search laws, or government cuts to services, or, you know, things like structural racism, and that don't change, but they kind of just transform over time. And so because there was a lot of material, that's my uncle, by the way, here. Because there was a lot of material, I also had a QR code that people could scan and take the archive away to read later. But, you know, I was interested in having two generational and intersectional perspectives of the same area coexisting. And, you know, my uncle had been challenging a lot of views about the area that were kind of, and how it was written about, for example, in publications, narratives, like mainstream narratives about people that live there, for instance, like by journalists who wrote about young people in gang culture, which demonized them or distorted the role that racism, economic hardship, and housing play. So there were like draft letters that he'd written to try and challenge some of those mainstream media narratives. So yeah, it just became something that I couldn't not share. And I was going to show you the video that I made, which is 6 minutes. I can probably show you that now, I think, and then I can just come back to speaking about the last third and final part. Somewhere I also have the QR code. If anyone is interested in scanning it, they can access the archive. But there was some just really outrageous language, for instance, used, which suggested kind of wanting to clean the area up. And so, yeah, you can scan this if you like, and using your phones, and that can take you to all that material in a Google Drive folder. So yeah, I might just play this video quickly. I'll maybe say something about it after.
No, my parents.
Try to remove yourself from your head.
But what have I done?
Nothing. I'm talking this about language, about how we interact with each other and how we treat each other and the tone that we use and the language that we use. That's what I'm talking about. So please. No. Stop it. Someone's not doing it then. Stop it. I don't fucking put anything away. It's not fucking funny, is it?
So the video was shot using a drone, and I wanted it to have this kind of disorientating effect. Sorry, I just got to find my slides again. Wanted it to have this kind of disorientating effect of moving up and down the same familiar place again and again and again until you eventually transcend or move towards a different perspective. Just going to open my slides once more. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the soundtrack was comprised of recordings that I'd made in nightclubs, also of me arguing with my boyfriend, of me sleep talking, and it kind of ended with this recording of my dad playing the flute not long before he passed away, and it kind of moves from being really frantic to soothing, a bit like a kind of consciousness slipping away or leaving its abode. And I shot this, like I mentioned, I shot the video with a drone, so I was kind of looking at it from above, and it kind of revealed this almost phallic-like shape of the street. But I was also interested in like kind of the drone's relationship to kind of surveillance as well. And I'm just conscious of the time now, but the third and final part, Man Dog, was more like an object response to the other two parts. So the works that I showed somehow embodied the ideas that parts 1 and 2 were engaging with. And to the right here, you see this red sweat panel with this one line interrupting the surface the entire way through, a bit like this kind of line of descent, and the kind of maybe the substance being more blood-like this time. And the lighting was a bit dimmer, and you had these kind of ramshackle sculptures on the floor that were kind of reminiscent of pet beds on newspaper, and they were actually titled after dead pets. And they kind of felt like something that you wanted to kick out of the way, but there was also something tender about them, possibly as a site of comfort or containment. And I made these blankets using fake fur and like teddy bear kind of fur and men's shirting that resembled kind of cages, I noticed, like stripes or bars of the cage. And so, yeah, these different still lifes were presented on newspaper clippings, this time contemporary ones that I would pick up, which said something both about, you know, kind of living in London right now, but also some of them contained these kind of racialized or gender fraud narratives that are really prevalent. And to the back, this one had these kind of flashing lights, a bit like a kind of a router flashing or trying to communicate something. And then to the back, on the back wall was this Obsidian Mirror. And obsidian is a kind of volcanic rock, which is produced under immense heat and pressure. And I originally came across a Obsidian Mirror in Pompeii, and I was able to have this rock polished highly so it became reflective. And I used a device called a sound exciter to make the entire object into a speaker. And so this mirror spoke, and it played a soundtrack that I recorded in a gay chat room of some hate speech. And rather than give the hate speech more airtime, I kind of abstracted some of it to a point that it became quite abstract sounding. And so you would get kind of, you would hear parts of this 15-minute monologue with this guy who strangely kind of brought up dogs quite a lot. He spoke about wolves in sheep's clothing. He spoke about, you know, territory, but he also spoke about wanting to speaking to a dog online. So there was something to do with kind of like his loneliness and kind of ideas around submission and power that I was playing with. And then the final work in the show was this kind of 4 pairs of legs behind a wall, which was called Beneficiary. And I was kind of thinking about collectively the 8 legs as like those of a spider. So they're made in white plaster and wrapped in these identical white socks. And they kind of alluded to this collective body made up of more of the same body that became this kind of beneficiary of the space. And that was the final work in the show. So I'll stop there and invite any questions if anyone has any.
Okay, thank you so much for walking us through your work of the last few years, also very recent work. It's been a pleasure to listen to you describe it in such a concise way. materially, but technically, but then also in terms of layering of meanings. I also invite you to bring your questions forward. Please use the Q&A section, or if you feel more like typing into the chat function, then do that, or raise your hand. We can invite you to really join us here with an image or with your voice, whatever you prefer. Yeah, I mean, it's been such a rich presentation. I have actually plenty of questions or things to come back to, because it is such a layered work, and it's very interesting how this operation of abstraction functions in one way to distantiate from your very personal biographical experience, but then again, the act of abstraction brings it closer to an experience of people who don't relate probably too much to cultural venues that have been introduced, or don't know codes that have been brought up here, tied to the use of these places. So I've been wondering, because your work also develops against the backdrop of maybe growing up in 1980s UK, Maggie Thatcher, and sort of super increasingly neoliberal regime that had its impact also on urban development and so on. That's all there, present in your work somehow. Then again, there are these other layers of more globalized culture with, let's say, fragments from IKEA, or just like those artifacts deprived of their use value in your costs. When you come to a place like in Germany, the KW, or wherever, do you sometimes then also work with locally specific narratives, or things you pick up from in a more site-specific way? I mean, you've introduced also the cost from that former love hotel that had a relationship to the place the exhibition was actually held. That was a question.
Yeah. I mean, I tend not to work so much in that way, if I'm honest. Like, you know, I kind of try and avoid it becoming a sort of ethnographic or anthropological inquiry. It's usually has a more personal starting point, but then inevitably I'm conscious of the context in which it exists. And that was a real kind of happenstance moment where this one head of David that I was looking for, that was from Chariots, I realized it had this kind of resonance with another venue, another sex venue, and that kind of led me to think about the types of histories that are often referenced in these spaces as being similar. So in that particular instance, it was a kind of, it was by chance, but it kind of led me, or kind of, it led me to pursue that path a bit further, because I was concerned about what it meant to be presenting something that was so specific to a kind of London audience, and a small one at that, in somewhere like the Kunstverein in Hamburg. But I think, you know, it was also a surprise to me of how there are different ways in which people can still engage with it, despite not having experienced it. Even the sense that kind of the lockers took on, you know, a kind of, they mirrored something of the institution already. So like when people walked through the museum, they were the existing lockers, and then you'd start to read into the scratches and the dents of the lockers presented from Chariots, and start to understand the history of a different space through a kind of equivalence with your own experience as well. So it kind of made some worlds kind of come a bit closer in a way.
Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, we also have a question from the audience, and it's from Rafael Gigax. He says, thank you so much for your talk. You've been invited in the past to shows around the topic of queer abstraction. How would you define that term for you?
Well, I kind of maybe see abstraction as a way of refusing a means of, or refusing or resisting visual taxonomies that kind of regulate. So in a way, I kind of see queer abstraction as a way of kind of resisting a fixed category in a sense. And I think I've enjoyed using that in the past, but recently I'm also kind of curious about what it means to be centering certain bodies more explicitly as well. So yeah, I think I've sort of queer abstraction for me, it's connected to the kind of politics of representation really, and kind of finding ways and times in which that feels generative or not to be categorized. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. We don't have an immediate response from Raphael, whether the question has been answered in a satisfying way, but I guess so. Another thing, maybe related, maybe not, the critical theorist and feminist philosopher Nancy Fraser came up with the term of counterpublics already a few years ago or decades ago, and I think that notion is somehow very present in what you're doing. Is it something you try to reshape or recreate through your work, or am I sort of enforcing that discourse on you? And yeah.
Can you repeat that? The
counterpublics. So kind of a third space between the more conventional notion of public and private.
Yeah.
As a sort of place where oppositional interpretations of identities, interests, and needs can be performed.
No, definitely. It's something I think that I've been drawn to. Clearly, those spaces that exist in between work and home, for instance, and that act as meeting places for certain communities. That's kind of, yeah, naturally is an environment and space I'm interested in, both as kind of one that's designed and one that can be remade. And I think maybe with installations like the one that mimicked the cruising site, the men-only cruising site, you know, I was interested in what it means to be representing that in a different public space, so that you know, gender non-conforming people, so that women, the people that are usually excluded from that kind of space, can experience this kind of mirrored version of it in a way that existed in the same time and space, but just down the road, you know. And it was to present in that situation a kind of highly orchestrated image. So again, trying to be conscious of the kind of ethics around going in there and photographing or videoing, but like wanting to also share something of my experience of those spaces through a more public dialogue.
Yeah, it's interesting because some places like very big and famous sauna club in Munich, for example, also gay cruising club, is offering public tours as a sort of an act of mediation to create a more tolerance, probably also. And I've been wondering what it does when someone is kind of reporting back rather than inviting people to the actual site. in the format of an art installation, and then also transports it to the art context of a gallery.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely something I also want to keep thinking about.
It's something that I feel very conscious of, both as a kind of insider and outsider in that space, because, you know, the other thing that I've had more confidence to try and speak about through the work has been how many of these spaces are kind of quite white male dominated. And so I feel like, you know, maybe my kind of background as being both inside and outsider sort of affords me a position to maybe try and broach some of those things. But in past work, where I think I've used abstraction, is also been to sort of prevent this kind of titillating view into spaces that some people can't go into. So it's always a kind of tricky thing to negotiate. But that installation in particular, People Come and Go, was an instance of where I kind of tried to push the extremes of, rather than, you know, maybe more subtly working with material and formal qualities of a space, kind of try and test that extreme a bit.
Yeah. I also thought it's interesting how you use side axes or axes different points of view in your installation. You also brought that up on the one hand with the watch queens, but then also in the exhibition Balconies, so that we also get a peek on top of that lowered ceiling. Yeah, I kind of relate that also to these different perspectives or points of view one is also forced to take by the environment.
No, for sure. And I think that does intrigue me, these kind of like parallel perspectives. And it's kind of almost like a kind of queer phenomenology, you know, like rethinking the kind of grooves and the lines with which we've been instructed to think about things in a way.
Also, that part of the work where you show your birthday cake of your, or a replica, let's say, of your birthday cake, it reminded me a lot of a text by Jack Halberstam in A Queer Time and Place, which is also about different rituals or rites of transition in a queer life that somehow then create also a different spatiality and timing, differing from maybe a more heteronormative model that is clearly structured by, I don't know, birth, marriage, children arriving, and so on. So yeah, I really enjoyed also that your works invite so many connections to think it in other frames and with other theories that relate to the topics. But I would strongly invite again our audience and of course also our students. I think it's been very instructive in a sense of how you start from a personal experience, but then make a work that makes you overly vulnerable or overexposes your biography or personal experiences. That's definitely something instructive, probably also when someone starts with art making. Yeah, anyone, join us. You can also raise your hand, or I don't know, there's probably a lot of big threshold here to overcome with the webinar situation. If not, maybe a closing question from my side. And always, if I say it's a closing question, then suddenly someone still uses the opportunity. So you've shown us this very recent three-part exhibition project, The Descent. What's coming next? Can you give us a sort of sneak peek, except for coming to Zurich to our school and teaching students for 1 week in November? Is there something you feel okay to tell us about your future plans?
Yeah, I mean, well, really the main thing is the teaching, which I'm really looking forward to. But I will be showing some new work at Art Basel Miami with the gallery I work with, Southern Reed. So that's kind of November time. And I've made these tiles over the last few years that kind of, rather than reproducing this cruising site, kind of become mediations and reflections of this park opposite where I live, or used to live, in Bethnal Green. And so they are kind of mostly taken from my window, but some also outside looking in. And they've been images I've collected over years, maybe like 6 years. And they're printed again, very kind of faintly. And I was just sort of interested in that shared social space and how it's regulated and surveyed. And within the series, there's also kind of figures this time, and one of those figures happens to be the police. So it's kind of me also watching the police, watching other people, and sort of how certain bodies and people convene in that space. So kind of trying to subvert this policing gaze back onto them, and which we know kind of targets Black and brown communities disproportionately. So those are new works, which I shall be showing alongside. Oh, sorry, I won't be showing those works, actually, not necessarily, but it stems from that interest in that space. What I will be showing are Obsidian Mirrors. I think I showed one very briefly in the last installation, but I'm showing a group of them that mirror one another, and they become like portals, a bit like the kind of view outside my window, this kind of portal to a different space. And there will be this kind of large wallpaper, which comes from one of the pictures I described in Middleton Green, this area where I live. And it will be presented very large format, so it kind of becomes a more abstract image. And I was thinking about that in relation to kind of proximity and closeness as well.
Yeah, thank you for this insight. Sounds exciting, and I'm also happy against the backdrop of your lecture. We really already could imagine how it could look, how it might look. And yeah, so still a last chance. Then also I want to dismiss you or give you the opportunity to enjoy your evening outside of Zoom. So very last chance. If not, thanks a lot, Prem. It's been a great pleasure to meet you here on Zoom. I'm really looking forward to see you in Zurich in November. Happy that you'll be coming. And thanks again for this great lecture.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing you in November.
And then, of course, thanks also to our audience who persisted and is still with us. And I'm wishing everyone a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So much. Bye-bye.